when I started to remember all this, for me it was like, I had no idea what is happening. I had no idea what is all this information about. And when I was 16 years old in this life, I was so lost, so scared that suddenly I start to feel my higher self coming inside the room, and everything started to change. And he said his name, his vibration, and touched my third eye. And in that moment, I could feel the dimensions, like everything and expanding everywhere. It's like having ayahuasca, taking ayahuasca, but without ayahuasca.
Yeah.
Just with the higher self.
Yeah. When did you first realize that you could remember existences beyond this current one as Matías De Stefano?
The thing is, I was also born in a family that it was skeptical, no religion at all, nothing, all atheists, no spirituality, nothing. So for me, for my family, for my environment, it was always me being very creative, very imaginative. I was telling these stories that I remember from other times, from other dimensions, from other places, but I didn't call it dimensions or lives, or I just was telling what I knew. And for them was like, oh, so interesting. And
just a really creative boy.
Yes, that was it. So in my family, no one ever told me, shut up, don't say these things, or don't share that, because there was no cultural background to tell what was wrong. I just had that environment that was nice, was good for me. So when I started to explain, to share what I had, was natural for me to tell to my mom, or also to my companions in class, at school. There was a teacher that saw the aura, so I was talking to her all the time. So it was not a complicated thing for me to accept. Really, what I felt was that was normal, that everyone was like this, but nobody could remember that they were like that.
Yeah.
And when I was growing up, I understood that I was different, but not because I was special, but because I just had the environment that allowed me to keep that alive.
I don't know, man. I had the environment that would have allowed me to keep that alive. I can't remember any past lives. You know, why do you think you had the access? It seems like that's part of the agreement. Part of the agreement is we forget so that we can remember. But you were like, nah, I'm not signing that agreement. I'm coming in and I'm remembering. And I think that's important because we need this information.
We usually put a very heavy weight in a cultural aspect and religious aspect regarding if someone makes us forget or if we should remember or something like that. And my guides, my inner self, usually try to tell me reality is much more easier, and the best way to understand the universe is to know how biology works. You will see that you are made by many cells, thousands of cells, and each one is specified
trillions
in different
cells,
trillions, and each one of them is specified in specific actions. So there is one in the liver that is acting to process some food. There is the neuron to share information, and so on. So there are specific neurons dedicated to memory, and there are specific neurons dedicated to the heartbeat. And also cells. So cells, neurons, everything inside the body is specified in different stuff. What would happen if every cell, once they say, we want to be like the heart? So you die. You don't exist anymore. So we need to be different. Some of us need to remember, is in our nature. And for others, their nature is not to remember, so they can work in what they are doing, in their organs. But we all have memory.
Right.
That's for sure, because the cell regeneration, the cells know what to do. They know the path. They know inside the inner truth, because we all come from the same cell, the mother cell. So all the cells has the entire information, but they know how to activate a specific information. Otherwise, the organ will die.
So tell us about specifically, when did you start realizing and remembering specific lives, not just the stories, but you started to have an understanding like, okay, I lived here in Chem. I know I lived here in this place. Tell us about some of these existences that you started to remember yourself existing in.
The first time that I started to remember was when I was 11, 12 years old. I don't know exactly, but was that age. It was history class at school. I was in school in Argentina, and the teacher gave us a paper with ancient civilizations, 3000 BC and so on, origin of Egypt and that. And so I was looking at it, and I started to have a headache, and I couldn't see the pyramids as it was in the picture. I saw it in a very different way. I couldn't see the Sphinx as it was. I saw everything completely different, and I was standing at it, observing that in the body of a woman, and besides me was my partner, and I was worried about something. So that was my first memory. And
almost like a flashback experience, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's like when you realize that you had a trauma and suddenly you said, oh, this is why I cannot do this or that. You know, it was like that flashback and very heavy headache. So it started like that, and all was emotions. Sometimes people think that I started to remember ancient civilizations. No, I remember my son, my husband, my mother, my grandmother, my family, my friends. And through them, I could understand the environment.
Right.
So it was not that I was just remembering data. I was remembering emotions. And through the emotions, I could understand the culture, the language, everything that was happening there. And since I was 12 years old, I started to live like parallel lives, like this life here and the other one that I was remembering like every day, like if it was alive, like if I was living that life in parallel. But sometimes I remember when I was a child, sometimes when I was an adult. And suddenly some flashes came from other ages, from other times that I couldn't really understand or explain. Norway 900 years ago, or suddenly other planet in other completely different system. And it started to be worse and worse. I say worse because I couldn't focus in this reality. I couldn't keep going with my studies normally. Sometimes I was forgetting who was my mom, her name, because if I knew so many others. So it was really confusing and chaotic. And that was the first life, which was in Chem, now called Egypt. Everything in the universe is so aligned. So it was prepared for me to see that image in that moment specifically. Because when I was 12 years old, in that time, in that life, my dad died. And I was in charge of his work, basically with 12 years old. So that's why I was so worried, because I was only 12 and I was in charge of a village completely. And all that situation there was like pushing me to understand the whole civilization, the whole thing. And the main thing that happened for me here is that at 12 years old, I see the image of the same thing that I saw when I was 12 years old, worried. So it's like a memory cell of something that tells me this is the story you need to remember. This is the story that will help you to understand what is happening now.
As your understanding of the 9 dimensions is that largely from this life that you had in Chem and the teachings and the understandings you had there, or is it pulled from many of your other different lives?
It was like this. When we were in Chem, we were taught about all this, but in a very different way because it has a very cultural and religious point of view. So the 9 dimensions were called the 9 tiers of Mahas. That was the main god. The way in which they were spread was through sound and music, and the explanations were very human. But when I started to remember all this, for me it was like, I had no idea what is happening. I had no idea what is all this information about. And when I was 16 years old in this life, I was so lost, so scared, that suddenly I start to feel my higher self coming inside the room, and everything started to change. And he said his name, his vibration, and touched my third eye. And in that moment, I could feel the dimensions, like everything, and expanding everywhere. It's like having ayahuasca, taking ayahuasca, but without ayahuasca. Just with the higher self.
Yeah.
It was a trip. It was immense. And in that moment, beyond time, beyond lives, beyond experiences in my past lives,
You just had the truth.
I could connect that. And it was the network. It was like connecting the dots. So I could.
Yeah. So it wasn't necessarily from a memory of a particular existence. It was your higher self downloading basically this information to you, giving you access to it. When you say the higher self, what does that mean to you? And we'll probably land there in our 9-dimensional map. But to you, what is the higher self? What is that?
Well, to put it in a human word, religious people say God, and science people say the sun. So let's call the God sun. So both of them is the same thing, but both of them is only one thing that shines. So this shiny thing has many rays of light that goes everywhere. So every ray of light is what we call higher self, which is a high expression of the divine, but in different perspectives.
Different articulation.
Yeah. So it's like the rays of the sun. Then the rays of the sun, they are made up with information, which are the photons, the particles of light. So that's what we could call the souls. The souls are the ones that brings information from one place to another, going through everything. So photons. And then when it finds crystals, like water, like some carbon or something like this, the ray of light divides itself in different harmonies, in different frequencies. So you can see the rainbow. So the rainbow is like different lives, like different aspects of the self. For example, me, Matias, is one of them, one of those colors.
One frequency, one color.
Exactly. So I am one of those colors, but I have 6 more around. Let's say more. Let's say 11 more than me, because it's 12 colors actually. So there are 11 people that are part of my higher self, which is one ray of light from the sun, which is God. So if you multiply that for every ray of the sun, you have millions, trillions of higher selves that express themselves in different personalities or frequencies that we call me or you.
Yep.